Hello and welcome to Spotlight. NATO and defense leaders from about 50 countries meet at the United States Ramstein Air Base in Germany. This is the latest arms pledging conference by Western states to discuss sending more weapons to Ukraine, including modern battle tanks. Russia, however, once again has said that these weapons change nothing on the ground, but will only prolong the war. On Thursday, Foreign Minister Lavrov said that Moscow will sober up the EU and NATO, who seek to weaken and defeat Russia, while former Russian President Medvedev warned NATO that a defeat for Russia in Ukraine could trigger a nuclear war. We're going to discuss the latest developments regarding the war in Ukraine in tonight's Spotlight program with our guests. Director of Global Studies at Wayne State University, Mr. Said Khan, joining us from Detroit. Also, we have Andrei Dobryansky, Chair of UN Affairs, the Ukrainian World Congress, who's with us from New York. Well, gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Said Khan in Detroit. The U.S. and Finland, they've already announced new military aid for Ukraine, despite Russian warnings that more weapons will mean more war. Give us your perspective on the recent developments, please.
Well, I don't know if it necessarily means more war. I think Russia has an awful lot to do with deciding if there is the minimization and reduction of the war. Given the asymmetric nature of the balance of power between Russia and the Ukraine, one would think that some kind of aid that is being provided to Ukraine would appear to be a goal toward more equity. In the case of Finland, I can understand why they would be interested in providing aid. They share a very long border with Russia. And of course, they are concerned of Russia's past rhetoric when it comes to what and how they view their neighbor to the north, Finland, when it comes to matters of potential encroachment. For the United States, with a pledge of an additional $2.5 billion in weapons, this seems to be tied in large part to also allaying concerns by the European Union that the United States is not pulling its so-called fair share in providing assistance. After all, the U.S. is very good with its rhetoric in its support when it comes to Ukraine, but hasn't necessarily been, in the estimation of the EU, putting its money where its mouth is. So this will certainly be in furtherance of that.
Mr. Dobryansky, Russia has accused Western countries of pursuing, quote, destructive policies by supplying Kiev with weapons and training and not seeking to find a solution to end the conflict. The Russian president has said that Western countries are exploiting Ukraine and using its people as, quote, cannon fodder. Just recently, the Russian foreign minister said that Washington has subjugated Europe in order to wage war against Moscow. Walk us through these comments and whether you agree with them or not.
I don't think anybody in the world really agrees with those comments. We see that in resolution after resolution in international bodies, whether that's the United Nations, the OSCE, and numerous international conventions that Russia is a party to. So what is happening here, and while I agree with most of the statements of my colleague, I will say that Russia has very much shown itself to be a paper tiger. So in terms of calling it an evening out of the military parties, it's quite clear that Russia has been unable to do any more than it has projected onto Ukraine to achieve victory there. What we've seen most recently in the last week has been private military contractors subsidized by prisoners being sent into Ukraine to achieve Pyrrhic victories, which really don't take hold of any population centers or anything like that. So it's quite clear that what's happening with the supply of weapons from Ukraine's allies, and let's just remind everybody that there aren't any allies that Russia can turn to apart from North Korea, perhaps Iran and Syria. Apart from that, they're not really achieving any weapons technology from anywhere else. So Ukraine has the benefit of working alongside its long-standing Western partners. And it's not just Finland, it's not just the United States. But in the last 7 days, and I was just in Ukraine 7 days ago, we've had weapon pledges in addition to what's been before from all three Baltic countries, from Poland again, and many other countries. So when we're talking about Europe needing to step up to the plate, it is frankly those large financial centers of France and Germany that the United States would like to see more come out of.
Said Khan, do you agree with our guests in New York?
I think in most part, yes. I think, though, that one has to go ahead and consider the fact that Russia, though, still is a nuclear power. And I know that many would go ahead and argue that Russia wouldn't dare to go ahead and use some kind of nuclear weaponry. But there are tactical weapons, there are tactical nuclear weapons. And at this point, we simply don't know how Russia would respond. There is both a certain level of erratic behavior on the part of President Putin, and at the same time, as we approach the one-year anniversary, clearly it has moved beyond the 3 days that Putin had promised his own people and the rest of the world would be the campaign within Ukraine. Ukraine has shown remarkable resolve and resilience to defy the act of aggression. But at the same time, we have to also recognize, as my colleague said, that while Russia may appear to be a paper tiger, it is exactly when a tiger is cornered that it sometimes becomes more dangerous. So again, we really have to wait and see how Russia is going to respond to these kinds of measures that are now being taken.
All right, Said Khan, I'm going to stay with you. NATO members have met to discuss whether to send modern battle tanks to Kiev. In recent days, German officials said they won't send their modern Leopard tanks to Ukraine and would not allow any other country with German-made tanks to send them either. Also, according to reports, Berlin will supply its tanks only if the U.S. sends its Abrams tanks first. Why this hesitation from Germany and from the U.S. even, for that matter?
I would say for two reasons. One is that it shows a certain attitude by Western countries that no one really wants to take the physical lead on this matter. And so Berlin is looking to Washington, Washington is looking to Germany. And while this happens, Ukraine's needs go unanswered and unaddressed. There's also, I think, one thing that people have not considered when it comes to the kind of weaponry that's involved. I mean, the Abrams tank is a highly complex piece of machinery. The training learning curve will be very steep. The idea of an Abrams tank being lost in Ukraine and perhaps then being seized by Russia is a matter of concern for the Pentagon, given the kind of technology that it has. Falling into the wrong hands and essentially being reverse engineered would be a problem. And then there's also the weather. The idea then of both the Leopard tank from Germany as well as the Abrams tank, both very sophisticated weapons, coming into the Ukraine with a timetable of the spring means that the ground and the terrain will have started to soften. Right now it is winter time. The ground becomes a little bit more solid. But imagine these tanks having to maneuver in March or April when there are rains and when it becomes rather muddy. So I think there's probably a lot of diffidence on the part of the United States as well as Germany to have this investment placed on the ground in Ukraine and what that will necessarily mean for their weaponry to be effective in the field.
Mr. Dobryansky in New York, same question to you. Talk to us about this split in NATO regarding providing the modern tanks to Ukraine.
Well, we do have the pledge by the United Kingdom first and foremost. With regards to Germany, there are many different variations of what exactly will happen with them. I always look back to the beginning of this conflict and the fact that Patriots were off the table, and now Patriots are being pledged by various countries, not just the United States. With the German tanks, you have about 2,000 of them spread out across various NATO allies. Less than half of those are of the newest technology, the ones that we would not want as a Western country to fall into Russian hands. So we're talking about the older variants of them, of which Ukraine really would estimate need maybe 100 at most, which is why they're looking at that technology, because it will be closer than getting an Abrams. As opposed to the Abrams, let me just add one more thing, that both Secretary Lloyd Austin and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs made it clear that in their estimation, after talking with the German ministry, that whatever promise the United States would make would not affect the decision of Germany. So that should be kind of bifurcated at this point. But let's concentrate on what has been promised by the United States, which are these Bradley fighting vehicles, which currently we have already begun training Ukrainian soldiers on. The Bradley fighting vehicle is as effective, in my estimation, as an Abrams for the kind of fighting that will be happening in Ukraine. It is a treaded vehicle, and it can keep up at the same speed as the highly effective Abrams tank. However, it offers the mobilization of the troops, because not only do you have those powerful TOW missiles that can destroy a tank, and the powerful machine gun, which has not only decimated Soviet technologies like the T-72s in foreign conflicts in Afghanistan, but actually in the first Desert Storm War, those Bradley fighting vehicles accounted for more destroyed tanks than the Abrams tanks. So this is a very significant fighting vehicle. And then you'll have the non-treaded variation, not variation, but the Stryker, which is on wheels, that's even faster than the Bradley vehicle. And these are methods for the Ukraine forces to fire while moving their forces at the same time, because both of those vehicles can accommodate 6 to 8 infantrymen within them.
I'm going to stay with you, Mr. Dobryansky. Russia has time and again said countries supplying weapons to Ukraine and training its soldiers were, in fact, parties to the conflict. Now, the question is, will this support result in this conflict spilling over into other regions and possibly turning into something bigger?
I think that's the message that Ukraine has had and the West has had, as the NATO alliance and EU, from the very beginning of Putin's presidency. We know already that legacy troops never left territories after the dissolvement of the Soviet Union, but we've had the war in Georgia. We've had additional troops sent into Nagorno-Karabakh. We've had obviously this invasion of Ukraine. I think the focus on containing Russia, as has been mentioned by numerous defense secretaries and foreign ministers since the beginning of this full-fledged conflict in Ukraine, is exactly what needs to be talked about. We need to contain Russia so it doesn't spill out. I was just with a senator of the United States last night, and he made that point very clearly. We do not want this conflict to spill to a NATO territory, why it needs to be stopped. It should have been stopped in Georgia. It should have been stopped in other areas. But if we don't stop it in Ukraine, it will absolutely continue on to NATO countries.
And Said Khan, I want to get your perspective on that as well. The risks of this military support resulting in the conflict spilling over into other regions and possibly turning into something bigger. Also, on the previous question that we just talked to our guests in New York about the issue of sending these modern battle tanks to Ukraine, Russia said that the modern tanks actually will change nothing on the ground. Give us your perspective on both those issues.
Well, first of all, I don't think that Russia really then understands modern warfare. And perhaps the reason why they're seemingly being so dismissive of it is because they know full well that, in fact, it will change the balance of power on the ground. Having heavy artillery is very effective, both against artillery that Russia is sending in and, of course, also against any kind of infantry force. The second point about that is that, remember, tanks, whether it is the Bradley or whatever might else be pledged, are still defensive weapons. And so here we find then weaponry that is being used within Ukraine to try to repel an aggressive and encroaching force, i.e. Russia. They are not an offensive weapon. If Russia wants to then go ahead and engage in this rhetoric, then perhaps we need to ask the question, what about Turkey, which supplies Ukraine with drones? Is Russia going to take any kind of hostile posture toward Ankara? Is it then fair game for the United States and the West to take posture against countries like India and China that are breaching the sanctions going on? We can go ahead and play this game of concentric circles and ask the question about whether this is going to metastasize and escalate. But I think that my colleague in New York is absolutely right. What we really are focusing on here is to prevent any kind of spillover into a NATO country, and to then exercise a very long-standing policy of containment.
All right, let's rewind. I'm going to stay with Mr. Saeed Khan of Detroit. Let's rewind to a past statement by U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who said one of Washington's goals in Ukraine is to see a weakened Russia. Why does Washington want a weakened Russia?
Well, I think we have to take a look at the context of this. While there are those, certainly in Moscow, which see this as a strategic statement, i.e. that Washington wants to see an enfeebled Russia moving forward in a geopolitical scenario, I think we can go ahead and give Secretary Austin the benefit of the doubt that he is seeking to see a weakened Russia with its operations in the Ukraine. And in this kind of conflict, of course, it is perfectly reasonable to then expect and desire Russia becoming weakened when it has invaded another sovereign state, and to see it weakened to the point where it either reevaluates its decision-making or preferably simply retreats altogether.
And same question to you, Mr. Dobryansky. The comments by the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin about the United States actually wanting to see a weakened Russia.
Wanting to see a Russia that would not have the capacity to do the same thing to other countries as it's doing to Ukraine, which the entire world wants to see. This has, again, been voted on in resolution after resolution at the General Assembly of the United Nations. Nobody wants to see a country that has already invaded its neighboring territories, given the ability to continue on and do more. This is the exact international framework that we have worked towards to prevent this kind of incursion onto neighboring territories. And Russia has thumbed its nose since the very beginning of this conflict. And I think the entire world, not just the United States, not just Secretary Austin, would like to see a Russia that is not in a capacity to invade other countries. It's not good for the countries that are being invaded, not good for the people who are victims of war crimes after war crimes by Russian soldiers. It simply should not happen.
What about the United States? A weakened United States that can't invade other countries. That's fair game, too.
I don't think we've invaded a neighboring country in a very long time.
Not a neighboring country, overseas countries.
Which country did we invade as a neighbor again?
I said overseas countries, not neighboring countries. So it's overseas. Okay. Neighboring is not okay. Overseas is okay.
I don't know. Was there a UN resolution that Russia worked on for a year and a half?
Yeah, we'll get back to you on that one. Yeah, we'll get back to you, Mr. Dobryansky.
But there was a UN resolution, right, for the Iraq war? Is that what you're talking about?
Saeed Khan, would you like to respond to him?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Okay.
I'm a bit confused. There were a few questions that were going back and forth.
Yeah, I don't want to digress from what we're actually talking about, but we'll get back to that in just a moment. But right now, on the issue of Russia and Ukraine, let's talk about Europe here. During a recent debate at the European Parliament, dissenting views were expressed regarding EU's foreign policy. Some legislators expressed support for Ukraine. Others warned that the bloc's own citizens should not be neglected in the process. Are European citizens on board with enduring these hardships?
I'm sorry, to whom are you asking the question?
This was for you, Mr. Saeed Khan.
Thank you. Well, I mean, the European Parliament is, of course, a deliberative body. It's going to have quite a bit of diversity. And while on the one hand, the European Union is going to try to speak with one voice, there are the complexities of issues on a national level. One being, of course, the economics with high inflation rate and the needs of many people. I mean, in many of these countries, as you've seen, even in France recently, there are protests regarding President Macron's decision to up the retirement age. That is then political fodder for those who are saying that why be concerned with a war that doesn't seem to necessarily impact us directly when there seems to be an urgent need for domestic issues to be addressed. Other countries, which either are more geographically proximate to the issue or militarily so, are going to have a different posture altogether. And then, of course, there's energy needs, which Russia certainly does supply to a good amount of the European Union. So dissenting opinions are hardly going to be seen as a surprise when it comes to the Ukraine and what kind of intervention needs to be done.
Mr. Dobryansky, massive inflation, a cost of living crisis, energy crisis. Some countries like the UK, they're having its citizens face unprecedented energy bills, with many European countries facing energy rationing. What is the cost of this conflict and its repercussions for Europe as opposed to the U.S.?
I think we're talking specifically about fossil fuel prices here, and I think the final cost will be the eventual migration away from our dependency on fossil fuels. It's been a point of contention in Germany for years now, the Russian pipeline and the fact that they were wedded to this kind of fossil fuel economy. We've seen the amounts of renewables that have just gone up for decade after decade, and in the end, Russia will not be the holder of all energy costs for the rest of Europe, and it will be renewables, and it'll be what's better for the entire planet as we move away from Russia, basically having everybody dependent on them.
So what's the end game here for Europe? What's the winning scenario looking like for Europe?
The winning scenario is the fact that the entire world will be in a better place if Russia will not be invading other countries and if Europe moves away from fossil fuels.
All right, Mr. Said Khan, would you like to add anything to that?
I concur. I think that a win for Europe would be to see Russia withdraw, for there to be some kind of, at the very least, détente between Ukraine and Russia. I think if it was a matter of an ideal situation, it would be that Russia also withdraws from territory that it has occupied and has claimed as being over its sovereignty, whether in the east of Ukraine or what really got this going, the Crimean Peninsula. That, I think, is going to be a much more elusive goal. I think just the idea of a détente might be enough to satisfy Europe to claim a victory.
All right, gentlemen, that's all the time we have for tonight's show. Said Khan, Director of Global Studies at Wayne State University, joining us from Detroit. Andrei Dobryansky, Chair of UN Affairs at Ukrainian World Congress, joining us from New York. Thank you for your comments here on tonight's Spotlight, and special thanks to you, our guests, for staying with us on tonight's show. It's good night for now, and see you next time.